Sandy Lawson hadn't planned to work in fashion. Growing up in a small town, she had never seen it as a realistic career choice. Yet here she was, managing the sales floor of Belle's boutique in Portland, a quaint shop filled with carefully curated items that attracted tourists and regulars alike. Working here had rekindled a spark within her, something she hadn't felt in years. She had an instinct for color, texture, and style, and she could transform even the plainest outfit into something striking with just a few adjustments. The shop felt like her sanctuary, a place where she could immerse herself in the world of fabrics and designs, far removed from the lingering ghosts of her past. It was during a quiet afternoon shift that she first met Caleb Monroe. He was browsing through a rack of vintage jackets, his fingers lightly tracing the fabrics, as though he could somehow read the stories embedded in them. Sandy noticed him right away, not because of his striking appearance, though he was undeniably handsome, with dark hair and a contemplative expression that gave him an air of quiet intelligence, but because he moved with a certain ease, as if he were at home among the clothes. He looked up, catching her gaze, and smiled in a way that immediately disarmed her. "Are you the fashion expert here?" he asked, his tone warm, with just a hint of curiosity. She laughed, taken aback by his straightforwardness. "I wouldn't say expert, but I do know my way around a fabric or two," she replied, stepping closer to help. They fell into an easy conversation, discussing fabrics, cuts, and colors as if they'd known each other for years. Caleb shared that he was a journalist with a love for vintage fashion, something he had inherited from his late mother, a former seamstress who had instilled in him an appreciation for the artistry of clothing. There was a gentleness in the way he spoke about her, and Sandy felt an immediate connection, sensing a depth in him that was both intriguing and comforting. Their initial meeting led to a series of coffee dates where their conversations drifted seamlessly from art to literature to the peculiarities of the Portland fashion scene. Caleb was different from anyone Sandy had met, thoughtful, introspective, and genuinely interested in her life and aspirations. He listened in a way that made her feel seen, as if her thoughts and dreams held value. Over time, their casual dates evolved into a full-fledged relationship. Caleb introduced her to his family, inviting her into his world with an openness she hadn't expected. His family lived in an upscale neighborhood on the outskirts of Portland, and Sandy immediately felt the disparity in their backgrounds. Caleb's family exuded a kind of effortless wealth that made her feel slightly out of place, but Caleb was quick to reassure her, insisting that she fit right in. However, it wasn't long before she encountered friction, specifically from Caleb's sister Katie. Katie Monroe was the embodiment of polished sophistication. She worked as a corporate lawyer and carried herself with an unyielding confidence that bordered on arrogance. She looked Sandy up and down with a critical eye during their first meeting, her lips curling into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "So, you work in retail?" Katie asked, a thinly veiled hint of judgment in her tone. Sandy felt her cheeks warm. "I manage a boutique, yes. I handle sales, merchandising, and client styling," she replied, keeping her tone polite. Katie's eyes flickered with mild interest. "How quaint," she said, before turning to Caleb and launching into a story about a high-profile case she was handling. Sandy felt a pang of discomfort, sensing that Katie had already dismissed her as unimportant, a mere fixture in her brother's temporary life. From that day on, Katie seemed to make it her mission to undermine Sandy at every opportunity. She'd make offhand comments about Sandy's thrifty lifestyle, sneering at her budget fashion choices and dropping hints about the luxury brands she deemed worthwhile. At first, Sandy brushed it off, refusing to let Katie's opinions dictate her self-worth. But as her relationship with Caleb grew more serious, the tension between her and Katie became harder to ignore. One afternoon, while shopping with Caleb and Katie, Sandy witnessed her worst nightmare. Katie spotted a designer handbag that was nearly identical to one Sandy owned, a handbag she had painstakingly hunted down at a thrift store and restored. Katie turned to her with a condescending smile. "Oh look, Sandy," Katie said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Here's the real version of that bag you have. You should consider upgrading sometime." Sandy clenched her jaw, struggling to maintain her composure. She cast a sidelong glance at Caleb, hoping he'd say something to diffuse the tension. But Caleb only chuckled awkwardly, shifting uncomfortably, as if he hadn't fully registered the sting in Katie's words. It was in moments like these that Sandy's doubts crept in. She loved Caleb, but his inability or unwillingness to stand up to his sister left her feeling unsupported. She knew he cared for her deeply, But sometimes love wasn't enough to bridge the gap between who they were and the lives they came from. As their relationship progressed, so did Katie's antagonism. Things came to a head when Katie asked Sandy for a discount on an item from Belle's boutique, something Sandy wasn't authorized to grant. She declined politely, explaining store policy. Katie's response was sharp and vindictive. "Really? You can't even do that for family?" Katie scoffed. "Figures. Some people just don't understand loyalty." The accusation stung, but what hurt more was Caleb's reaction. When Sandy confided in him about the incident, expecting him to take her side, he remained non-committal, defending Katie's request as just a simple favor. The conversation turned into a heated argument, with Sandy expressing her frustration over Caleb's continual lenience towards Katie's behavior. Caleb grew defensive, accusing Sandy of blowing things out of proportion, and the rift between them deepened. The breaking point came when Katie announced her engagement, setting her wedding date suspiciously close to the one Sandy and Caleb had chosen. Sandy's friends had already teased her about how Katie seemed to be mimicking aspects of her life. But this was the last straw. The rivalry had escalated from a passive tension to outright hostility. Katie made sure to flaunt her wedding preparations in front of Sandy, boasting about the extravagant details and carefully curated guest list. Caleb's parents, while polite, seemed unwilling to address the brewing conflict, perhaps hoping that it would resolve itself in time. As Sandy pored over wedding plans of her own, she found herself growing wary of sharing too much with Caleb, fearing that he might unintentionally pass details to Katie. Her distrust soured their relationship, but she didn't know how to approach the subject without igniting another argument. In the end, she resigned herself to the reality that Katie was intent on overshadowing her. On the day of Katie's wedding, Sandy arrived at the venue only to be met with a jarring sight. The entire setup was a near replica of what she had planned for her own wedding. She stood there frozen, her heart sinking as she took in the flower arrangements, the color scheme, even the table placement's details she had meticulously chosen, only to see them mirrored here at Katie's wedding. But the worst was yet to come. As Katie made her grand entrance, Sandy's breath caught in her throat. Katie was wearing a wedding dress strikingly similar to the one Sandy had designed for herself. The dress had been her personal project, an embodiment of her creativity and style, with intricate lacework and a unique silhouette. She had confided the design specifics only to Caleb, sharing her excitement about her dream dress. Seeing it here on Katie felt like a betrayal too deep to comprehend. Sandy looked at Caleb, hoping he'd be as shocked as she was. But he just watched Katie with an expression of mild amusement, as if he saw nothing wrong. Her voice trembled as she leaned over, whispering, "Did you tell Katie about my dress?" Caleb's face fell, and his silence was answer enough. Sandy's stomach churned with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. She knew that Caleb and Katie shared a close bond, but she never imagined he would divulge such personal details. Her hands clenched at her sides, the realization settling heavily upon her. The details she had entrusted to Caleb had been handed over to Katie, not maliciously perhaps, but certainly thoughtlessly, with no consideration for how it would affect her. Unable to contain her emotions any longer, Sandy stepped outside, her chest tight with frustration and betrayal. The cool evening air did little to soothe her, and the voices from the wedding inside felt muffled, distant. She wanted to escape, to run as far from this twisted spectacle as she could. But a hand on her shoulder pulled her back to the present. She turned to see Caleb, his face a mixture of concern and irritation. Sandy began, his tone patronizing. "I think you're overreacting. It's just a dress. Katie's wedding day isn't the time for drama." Sandy looked at him in disbelief, feeling as though the ground had disappeared from under her. "Just a dress. This is about trust, Caleb. About respect. I shared something personal with you, and you handed it over to Katie without a second thought." Caleb sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Katie's my sister, Sandy. I didn't think it was that big of a deal. She needed some ideas, and I thought she'd be inspired by yours. Besides, it's not like I could have known she'd take it this far." Sandy shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought you were different. I thought you'd understand." The hurt in her eyes seemed to catch him off guard, but he quickly masked it with an air of indifference. "Look, Sandy, if you're going to make this about sides, maybe you're right. Maybe we're not meant to be." The words hung between them, cutting deeper than either had anticipated. Caleb didn't reach out to comfort her, didn't apologize. Instead, he turned back towards the venue, leaving Sandy alone with her devastation. Inside, murmurs were beginning to spread. Caleb's parents, Margaret and Robert Monroe, had noticed the tension and approached Sandy with concerned expressions. Margaret, usually reserved, surprised Sandy by taking her hands, her voice gentle yet firm. "We saw what Katie did," Margaret said, her voice tinged with a mix of disappointment and shame. "That was unacceptable. She's gone too far." Robert nodded solemnly. "We're so sorry, Sandy. Katie has always been strong-willed, but this is more than we can condone." Their support was unexpected, and it offered a sliver of comfort, but it couldn't erase the betrayal she felt. Knowing that Caleb would always side with his sister, no matter how hurtful her actions, Sandy made a decision that had been forming in her heart for weeks. She returned to the venue, collected her things, and left without looking back. That night marked the end of her relationship with Caleb, a bittersweet conclusion that left her feeling hollow yet relieved. She had loved him, truly, but their differences were too vast, their loyalties too divided. For her own peace of mind, she had to walk away. The following weeks were a whirlwind of emotions as Sandy tried to piece her life back together. Ending things with Caleb had been painful, yet liberating. She threw herself into her work at Belle's boutique, channeling her anger and sadness into a newfound drive. Her manager, sensing her passion, offered her additional responsibilities, allowing her to work on special styling projects for high-profile clients. For the first time in months, Sandy felt a renewed sense of purpose. One day, a letter arrived, sent from Caleb's family lawyer. It informed her of a settlement offered by the Monroe family. At first, Sandy was hesitant. She didn't want their money, didn't want any reminders of the painful chapters she'd left behind. But as she read the letter more closely, she realized the settlement wasn't a bribe, but an acknowledgement of the unfairness she had endured. After much deliberation, she accepted it, viewing it not as charity but as a springboard for the future she wanted to build. With the funds, Sandy decided to take a leap she had long dreamt of, launching her own fashion styling consultancy. She envisioned a business where she could help clients find their unique style without succumbing to the superficial trappings of the luxury world that Katie so idolized. Her goal was to celebrate individuality, to create fashion that told a story. She rented a small studio space in the Arts District, modest but full of potential, and set to work on turning her dream into a reality. The early days of her business were challenging, filled with long hours and countless hurdles. But Sandy found herself thriving in the process, learning, adapting, and growing. She drew in clients who shared her vision, people who valued authenticity over ostentation, who saw fashion as a form of self-expression rather than a status symbol. Her reputation grew steadily, bolstered by word of mouth and the loyalty of her clients, many of whom became friends and allies in her journey. One day, while working on a photo shoot for a local magazine, she was introduced to a designer named Leo Vargas. Leo was a renowned figure in the fashion industry, known for his avant-garde designs and his unorthodox approach to style. He had heard of Sandy's work through mutual connections and was intrigued by her story. They hit it off immediately, their shared passion for creativity and authenticity forming an instant bond. Leo invited her to collaborate on an upcoming fashion show, a prestigious event that could catapult her career to new heights. It was an opportunity Sandy had only dreamed of, and she threw herself into the project with everything she had. Together they created a collection that blended Leo's bold vision with Sandy's subtle, personal touch. The result was a lineup that captivated the audience, receiving praise for its originality and emotional depth. The show was a success, and afterward Leo pulled her aside, his expression serious yet kind. "You have a rare gift, Sandy. You're not just designing clothes, you're telling stories. People connect with that." His words struck a chord, affirming everything she had worked for. In that moment, Sandy realized that she had found her place in the world, a path that was hers and hers alone. She was no longer defined by her past relationships or by anyone else's expectations. She was free to create, to inspire, and to live on her own terms. As her career blossomed, Sandy became a sought-after stylist, her work featured in magazines and galleries across the country. She traveled to fashion capitals around the world, immersing herself in the art she loved, meeting others who shared her vision of fashion as a force for personal expression. The boutique days seemed like a distant memory, yet they had laid the foundation for everything she had become. One rainy evening, after returning to Portland for a brief visit, Sandy found herself wandering the familiar streets near Belle's boutique. She hadn't been back in years, and nostalgia mixed with a sense of closure as she passed by the store windows, remembering the version of herself who had once worked tirelessly there. As she stood there, lost in thought, she heard a familiar voice call her name. She turned, and there, Standing in the drizzle was Caleb. Caleb's presence was a shock. He looked older, perhaps a bit worn, though he still had that familiar, casual charm that had once drawn her in. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of years and memories stretching between them. Finally, he broke the silence. "Sandy," he began, his voice tinged with something almost like regret. "I didn't think I'd see you here." "I could say the same," Sandy replied, keeping her tone steady. She was surprised by how calm she felt, no longer the heartbroken woman who'd walked out of his life that day. This was a different Sandy, a stronger, more self-assured version of herself. Caleb shuffled his feet awkwardly, avoiding her gaze. "I heard about your success. Everyone in town has. Congratulations, you've built something incredible." "Thank you," she replied, genuinely appreciative. Despite everything, it felt good to be acknowledged by someone who had known her before she'd become the person she was now. Caleb hesitated, then sighed. "I'm sorry, Sandy, for everything. For not seeing you, for not standing up for you when you needed it most. I didn't realize how much I was letting Katie control everything. I should have been there for you. I know it's too late to fix anything, but you deserve better." Sandy studied his face, noticing the remorse in his eyes. The words he was saying were long overdue, but they didn't carry the sting they might have years ago. She'd already forgiven him in her heart, letting go of the bitterness that had once consumed her. But hearing his apology allowed her to close that chapter with finality. "I appreciate that, Caleb. I truly do. But I've moved on, and I think you should too," she said gently. "What happened between us, it was a lesson for both of us. And in a way, I'm grateful for it. It pushed me to find who I really am." Caleb nodded, his shoulders sagging as if relieved to finally unburden himself. "I understand. I wanted you to know." They shared a brief, almost nostalgic smile, acknowledging the shared history that would always connect them but no longer held any power over them. With a simple nod, they parted ways, both of them lighter for it. As she walked away, Sandy felt a surge of liberation. This was the last piece of her past she needed to let go. She had moved forward, built a life that was truly her own, and Caleb's apology was the final seal on that journey. Life moved forward at a rapid pace, and as her consultancy grew, Sandy's reputation continued to soar. She gained clients from all walks of life, from aspiring artists to well-established figures in the industry. But with success came new challenges. Unbeknownst to Sandy, her newfound prominence had attracted not only admirers but also rivals, some of whom were willing to go to great lengths to undermine her. One day she received a troubling call from Leo. His tone was unusually tense. "Sandy, we need to talk. It's about the designs for our upcoming show." Sandy's heart raced as she listened to him explain. Somehow, confidential sketches for the show's collection had been leaked, appearing on a social media account run by a competing stylist. It was an unmistakable attempt to sabotage her hard-earned reputation, to tarnish the image she had painstakingly built. "What are you saying, Leo?" she asked, struggling to process the betrayal. "Are you saying someone from our team?" Leo's silence spoke volumes. Sandy knew that in their line of work, competition was fierce, but this betrayal felt personal. She immediately reviewed her team, narrowing down those with access to the designs. As she combed through recent hires and colleagues, she remembered a stylist named Brooke, who had joined her consultancy a few months prior. Brooke had been ambitious and hardworking, often going above and beyond. But there had been moments where Sandy noticed an undercurrent of envy in her demeanor, a hunger for recognition that bordered on desperation. Sandy confronted Brooke, hoping against hope that her suspicions were wrong. But when she looked into Brooke's eyes, the truth was there, plain as day. Brooke's expression hardened, a glint of defiance surfacing as she spoke. "Why should you get all the glory, Sandy? You waltz in here acting like some fashion saint, but we're all just trying to make it." Brooke snapped, her voice trembling with bitterness. "You had a wealthy ex-boyfriend, you had connections. Not all of us are that lucky." Sandy took a deep breath, pushing down the anger bubbling up within her. She hadn't come from privilege, hadn't had a wealthy family to rely on. She had fought for every inch of success, enduring personal and professional hardships along the way. But Brooke's resentment wouldn't allow her to see that. "Luck had nothing to do with it, Brooke," Sandy replied, her tone measured. "But betrayal, that was your choice." With Leo's support, Sandy removed Brooke from her team and began damage control, focusing on rebuilding trust with her clients. She offered full transparency, sharing her story and the challenges she'd faced with the betrayal. To her surprise, clients stood by her, inspired by her resilience. Though the experience was painful, it solidified her belief in her own strength and in the loyalty of those who genuinely respected her work. Months passed, and Sandy's business not only recovered from the sabotage attempt but flourished. She had managed to weather the storm, proving to her clients and herself that no betrayal could shake the foundation she had built. Through her resilience, she had inspired others and reinforced her place in the fashion industry. One evening, at the opening of a new gallery showcasing her latest collection, Sandy was approached by Margaret Monroe, Caleb's mother. Margaret's face was etched with a mixture of pride and regret as she looked at Sandy, now a poised, successful woman exuding confidence and grace. "I always knew you were meant for great things," Sandy, Margaret said, her voice warm. "Caleb was a fool for not seeing it sooner." Sandy smiled, feeling a sense of closure. Margaret's approval, once something she had sought so desperately, now felt like an added affirmation of her accomplishments. She no longer needed validation from the Monroes or anyone else for that matter. She had carved her own path, and her success was her own. "Thank you, Margaret," she replied softly. "I'm grateful for everything, the good and the bad. It all led me here." As the evening wound down, Sandy took a moment to herself, standing near a window overlooking the city. The lights twinkled below, a testament to the life she had built from the ground up. She thought back to the timid young woman who had once dreamed of a life in fashion, of recognition and respect. Now, standing in the glow of her achievements, she realized she had gained something even more valuable: self-respect, independence, and the strength to remain true to herself. Leo joined her, holding a glass of champagne, his eyes filled with admiration. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his glass. Sandy clinked her glass against his, feeling a surge of gratitude. This was her life now, her choices, her successes, her future. And as she stood there, surrounded by friends, colleagues, and clients who believed in her vision, she felt a profound sense of contentment. With a smile, Sandy took a sip of champagne, savoring the moment. She had weathered betrayals, heartbreaks, and setbacks, but she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more fulfilled. The past was behind her, and the future was wide open, filled with possibilities and dreams yet to be realized. The chapter of Caleb, Katie, and the Monroes was finally closed. Sandy was ready to begin a new story, one that was wholly her own. So if you love this story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell, and comment below. Your interaction helps us grow.